going to begin class today looking at Paul's letter to someone by the name of Philemon. It's an often overlooked letter. I don't think necessarily always on purpose or somehow that someone would avoid it, but just because it's the shortest of Paul's writings that we have, and because it's so personal and has very specific situations in mind, and yet it is so important in our understanding of New Testament faith, especially of the social applications of the Christian faith. Would you say that Paul is very strong in his writings on the spirituality and application to our spiritual state before God, our standing before God, who we are as not just physical beings, but spiritual beings? Would you say he's very strong on that? Sure. And ultimately, that's what matters, and that's what sets the pace for everything. But we also get from Paul, certainly other places, but here in Philemon, a very important word on social application of Christianity, especially in the aspect of equality of race, social class, and then we could apply equality in many other ways. Class issues that show up in every society in different ways. Some it's very strong, and in others it's sort of an undercurrent. And then we have issues of slavery and those who are abused or oppressed, taken advantage of, and we say, well, that doesn't happen in our world today. That's not a problem in America or the West, so that's not true. And certainly in developing cultures, there can be ingrained systems of oppression and taking advantage of people, and injustices towards humanity. And so Philemon stands as a word to the church, the Christian church, in our theology, how Christianity should be applied socially. It doesn't cover all the things, but in this short letter we get a very important word that undermines implicitly and somewhat explicitly issues of social standing, and in this case, bringing up the issue of slavery that was so common in the world of that time, with almost half the population living in some kind of debt slavery or living under the ownership of someone else and being taken advantage of whom Philemon was one of those owners, so to speak. And yet he was an important leader in the Colossian church, the early Colossian church that Paul was closely connected to. And so it's good to keep in mind that Paul's writing to Philemon was a part of his relationship with the Colossian church. The letter that he sent to the Colossians, his same heart, some of the things in his mind were in there when he thought about Philemon, because these were the Colossian believers. Philemon was one of them, as well as the church that met in his house there as a part of Paul's apostolic relationship with the church in that city. And that gives us a little bit of a tie to Paul's history and his relationship, why he would feel why he would believe that he would have a right to say some of the things he says, but he says very tactfully, clearly but tactfully. What is implied in his letter is a strong opinion and request, almost as if to say, without saying, you know, Philemon, you better do this. If you know what is right and you know what is good for you and for God's people, and you're being a righteous man, you should do what I say. He says that without saying that. Takes a lot of tact to know how to do that. You would think for Paul, what does Paul normally say? What is Paul's normal refrain? I could care less what people think about me, right? People that were angry with him and upset with him, I could care less about their judgments. I don't even listen to my own judgments of myself. I listen to the judge. But in this case, he is speaking respectfully, and he is honoring a prominent figure in the Colossian church without, catering or something, or brown-nosing or trying to win favor or approval. He is using gracious and respectful address in a personal way. to get a very clear point across, to undermine Philemon's right to a slave by the name, or a servant by the name of Onesimus, that had come into Paul's setting while he was under house arrest. So Philemon is written during his first house arrest imprisonment, when he is carrying his burdens for the Colossian believers and many others. And let's look at some of the details here. Isn't this it? Maybe you're more interested in Philemon than you've ever been interested before. This short letter. Who has heard something recently about, like, human trafficking or sex slavery or something like that? Every day, the church is paying attention to that now. The news outlets that are against Christianity, that's most of them, have a clear agenda. If you read behind the lines of the articles they post and the things they say, including some of the ones I read, clear agenda, anti-biblical Christianity. They'll put everything else out there. I've even noticed before that some of the anti-articles don't have like a comment thread. And then when they'll have one from like a Christian writer in one of the, they'll leave that comment thread open, 4,000 comments, people angry, fighting. And but even some of those outlets are putting articles out there about the issues of slavery that are coming to light in the world today. Right here in our own city in Rochester, in the last year or two, there have been big busts, and it's made the news, of human trafficking rings right here down the road. Roads that I drive on, I've driven on many times, some of them all the time, are used as highways to traffic human beings, some of them children, for sex slavery and such, right here down the road. Our own city. Oh, how could you say that about Rochester? I love this city. I think it's a great city. But it needs Jesus just like every town and every city. So Philemon and what we get here is so important when we think about social justice and the importance of being socially aware as believers, which has not always been a strength of evangelical Christianity. Evangelical Christianity has not always been real mindful of social issues. That dates back to the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and the fundamentalist modernist controversies of creationism and evolution. Those that were real concerned, some of the denominations that were very concerned about social matters, tended to side with the more liberal approaches of evolution and things and modernist views. And so the conservatives that said, no, you're taking God out of the picture if you throw creation out, backed away, and in so doing, backed very far away and antagonistically so from matters of social justice in the Christian church. Up until that time, Bible-believing movements were often very concerned and involved in issues of social justice. And a change happened in the late 1800s and the early 1900s as evangelicalism was born by its official recognition and name, in a sense, and was backing away from social matters by mistake. And now there's a refiring that is happening. Sure, some of it is a fad. You ever thought some of these issues are kind of a fad and it's going to blow over? And what happens when the excitement is over and they're not rolling out T-shirts and bumper stickers and all of those things for Christians to put in their cars? Who's thought those things before? What do we do when the fad is over? We live as New Testament-minded believers who hold in us the whole counsel of God, and we act on those things where God puts us. And I would say he uses fads. Is God able to use fads for good purposes, even though some of it might be lost when the fad is over? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Remember the WWJD bracelets? And the fad. It became a fad. Who's still concerned about what would Jesus do? Who still thinks of that more because of those bracelets, even though that fad is over? Comes to my mind more often. That's probably not the best illustration of that. But okay. Little details on this important letter that is a little bit puzzling unless we look at it in this frame of mind of issues of social justice and undermining things that normally you can't. Here's another important note about Philemon. This is an example of Paul undermining something where his influence will bear fruit in tearing down social problems and injustices. If Paul, in other places we're perplexed, Ephesians and other places where Paul says, slaves, obey your earthly masters. What? Right? Paul's words have been used. Everything you say can and will be used against you in the court of contest against the Christian faith. Still today, I've seen pictures of atheist groups that have put Paul's words about slavery on billboards to mock Christianity. And then they'll even put the reference there. And then they make it look like the billboards that say, I've seen these in real life on the road, traveling. It's a black billboard with white letters that says something like, I've been missing you, God. Like signed God. Who's seen those? I like those. I think they really get you. And they make you start thinking about things. And so Paul's words have been used against him where he has said other things. People have even used our marketing tactics to mock us. And Paul's words in other places perplex us, but we need to understand that he's thinking about the world as it is and working in the system of the world. He would never, ever give any kind of condoning of matters of things like the human trafficking and sex slavery, which is what's on our mind most of the time today. But in his day, with the system of society and such a huge part of the population being in some kind of indebted service or slavery and being under the command of another person, he knew that he knew that it wouldn't be fruitful to walk into the courts of his day and preach against them and tell them to tear that down because in Jesus everyone is equal. Those laws weren't listening to messages about Jesus. They didn't believe them, and he could have very much short-circuited his call to the Gentiles by going short-circuited as in an earlier loss of his head than already came. But here's an example where Paul has influence with people. There's a relationship there. There's love that is there. Does there always need to be love in a correcting word or relationship? Well, Christian love, but that doesn't mean you need to feel it with people. But here I would say he feels it, and they feel it between them, kindness and love, respect. And he has a word to bear fruit and tear down what it seems in other places he has accepted. First, written during his first imprisonment, to Philemon and the people in his house. And here's another thing, when Paul is addressing not only Philemon but also the believers in his house, the church that met at his house there, he's mindful of being careful when you are correcting a leader in such a way that it will become known to others. When you have a word that is countering or disagreeing with a leader, even Paul, who was over him, as an apostle in that sense, and a father in the faith, whose Philemon owed his very life to, Paul says. Paul honors his position in the respect that he has in the church, that as the leader of his home and the home that is hosting the church, Paul is honoring that even when he is correcting him in this way. That's important to think about, because we will have disagreements and things to say at times with leaders. Who's ever had a thing that they would have liked to, or that they wanted to bring up with a leader that you love and respect? Maybe it's just you want to know more of why they've said a certain thing or doing a certain thing. Sure, that happens to us all. And then people will come to you and say, why did you do that? Why did you say that? And sometimes they'll say it in a very honoring, respecting way, and it allows you to have a relationship. But other times, you don't know what to do because it was so disrespectful. Okay, well, that's for another time. But we get from Philemon in Geisler's words, the Christian view of slavery. Put very simply, if we were to say, what is the Christian view of slavery? We have to bring into the mix the challenge of Paul's seemingly affirming slavery in other places, but we need to think of context and where Paul is working and speaking. But we should let it be dominated by what happens in Philemon, which is an application of Paul's own theology. This is Paul applying his theology to slavery. Paul's belief, a foundation of his belief of what the church is in the world. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We are all one in Christ Jesus. Right? He says elsewhere. And here he is applying it where he believes it will bear fruit. It is an application of the theology of Paul, and we can say with Geisler, gives us the Christian view of slavery. Though Paul entreats Philemon to accept Onesimus, that's the slave, back into relationship, and without punishing Onesimus for running away, Paul's urging is aimed at enlisting Onesimus into the shared mission of the church in Philemon's home. Or possibly, it's possible that Paul's interest wasn't so much as that Onesimus would not only be released of his, but some believe that Paul's words are either, there are those that say it means he wants him now to be a respected member of the church and leader in the church in Philemon's house and that grouping of the church. Or it's possible that Paul was also including in his writing, implying that he wanted Philemon to release Onesimus completely so that he could stay with Paul. And that seems to be, the more I read and the more I go back to Philemon, it seems to me on top of everything else that Paul is doing with such a sensitive issue, he has the audacity to say, it's already audacious to say the things he said. That's why he's so tactful and careful, because what he is writing here, Paul knew, had the potential to cause a blow-up. If Philemon was not a man of integrity and was a prideful man, if Philemon was a prideful man, well, this is the church that meets in my home. I'm in charge of this church over here. If that was Philemon's attitude, and there are people that are like that, this letter would have been like, boom! Nuclear explosion in Paul's relationship with the Colossian believers there. This is not at all the case. It's already so audacious. Either or, if Paul is saying to Philemon, on top of what's already so audacious, let Onesimus serve with you in your church alongside you, that is like, people would be talking about that. Whoa, did you see what Philemon did? That guy? You know Philemon, he lives 3 doors down. His slave is opening up their prayer meetings. What is that crazy guy doing? That's socially, for that time, crazy, radical, what the gospel is doing. Or the other option that Paul was saying to him, I want you to release him to stay with me and serve alongside me and be an associate and an assistant to me even while I'm here under house arrest. Either one, it's one of the two, and they are both radical requests for the social world of that day. Yes?
Do we know Onesimus' final fate? Like, was he released or?
I don't think that we do, but it's just almost for sure that he would have been. Yeah.
And then also, what's the implications for the early church when Paul turns himself in this letter into a type of Christ towards Philemon or Philemon?
In the progression of his writing, you could say there's a picture there. If you step back and look at the themes of each section of Paul's letter, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
It's kind of like a picture of Christ's, of our relationship with God, coming to God and being reconciled. You can do that. Yeah. I wouldn't say that that's the intention. But to say that the Lord couldn't use that kind of an allegory or to say that the letter to Philemon is a type of Christ? Or what is Onesimus is sort of like us, being Jesus Paul is like Jesus coming in. We're like Onesimus. Oh yeah, that's there. I think that the incarnation of Christ in the gospel shows up in tons of relationships, in tons of things in the natural world. That happens to me all the time. When I'm in nature, I just feel like I just see pictures of God's ways and truth. And actually, I'm the kind of person, I feel the presence of God most often when I'm in the woods or something. But that's another side issue, so sorry, Joseph. Yeah, I think that Philemon could be like the law or something. The law, the world. If we look at it that way, Paul is like Jesus coming to reconcile us. And we're like Onesimus, and that's what you meant, right?
Yeah, like, would there be like heavy implications for that in the early church, like in their theology?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think the early church would have looked at that. Although I'm also speaking in ignorance of what the church fathers said of Philemon is hardly ever mentioned. And it's not because they didn't view it as a letter of Paul, and therefore very important to their faith, but it was just so short and had this singular, almost singular purpose. It just didn't show up in a lot of their teaching and theology. So, like today, same thing. We hardly ever hear about Philemon. So, yeah, so I want to say I don't think that they spiritualized it, that's spiritualizing it. But I could be wrong. So, okay. So we've got an audacious, radical request and theology that is coming through this letter that undermines the issue of slavery. Paul is calling on Philemon to let Onesimus live as an equal and no longer as a slave. In no uncertain terms, Geisler says. Although it is implied and tactfully with grace and really beautiful writing in his letter. It's a beautiful letter. In no uncertain terms, Philemon would have gotten the message. It would be that feeling of when someone, an apostle kind of a person or a pastor that you look up to sort of as like an apostle position, if you could think of someone that way. And you got a letter to them that at first reading was very warm and nice. And then the more you thought about it, you said, wait a minute. Wait a second here. There's things between the lines here, said with love and grace, but whew, he's telling me to do something. And this is here. To let him be an equal, no longer a slave. Paul and here's part of what Paul is bringing across some of his shove. Paul reminds Onesimus, I'm sorry, did I say Paul reminds Onesimus? Mm-hmm. Paul reminds Philemon that he is indebted to Paul for his faith and his life. And he undermines Philemon's claim on Onesimus in no uncertain terms. Okay, so things like the End It movement. I have a family member who works with a worldwide or world-renowned Christian compassion organization, and she works directly with people coming out of human trafficking, and I'll just leave it at that. And she sits with them and helps them get their life back together and put the pieces together in the midst of crisis and brokenness and shame and all of those things. And that kind of activity, and it's a passion that drives her. The social applications of Christianity and the gospel drive her, and it is backed up in the New Testament. Things like the End It movement and the red X on your hand and all of those kinds of things. Okay. And we also need to go to Hebrews today, but before we go there, I want to see what you have to say about that, about this material, or some thoughts. The book of Philemon. Yeah. Jake.
How close of friends was Paul with Philemon? Or did he just hear through someone else that, through Onesimus, did Paul and Philemon have a personal relationship with each other? In other words?
His letter doesn't mean, his kind of letter doesn't mean that they had a real close relationship. But he had some kind of contact with him where Philemon came into the fold of the faith because of Paul's ministry. So he knew him personally that way.
Wouldn't there be an opportunity for Philemon to not understand the between the lines intent? I mean, you can only speak to that way if you know the person, and they are going to be able to understand your gist and your rhetoric and your tone of your letter. Otherwise, if it's just someone you don't know, they're like, oh, look at this, all right, here we go.
Yeah. I think also the style of writing for the day was Paul's perfectly matching the type of letter that you would write to someone personally that is a formal letter that has a lot of weight behind it. It would be like you getting a personal, it would be like all of us, we go home for Easter break, and then there's a letter in the mail that says, the return address, Elam Bible Institute, Office of the President. And then you would say, what's that? And then you open up and think, oh, well, it's just sharing updates and things. And then you open it up and it says, Dear Jacob, handwritten, signed by the president. There would be a sense of like, it's different than just reading an update of activities of what's going on in the school and the different leaders of the school. This is a letter to you. And I think that Philemon would have had that sense of weight with the letter coming there. So I don't think, like I said, maybe he would read it at first and say, what a nice letter, and then later say, wait a minute. Probably, more realistically, he got it pretty quick. It was a little uncomfortable. Because here Philemon, Onesimus is on the run and has run away, broken the law illegally, and bolted. It's important, I'm glad you're asking this question because you didn't need to think I didn't say these things. Onesimus has run away from Philemon and possibly even stolen money because of Paul's talk about anything that he owes to you. It's possible that Onesimus also ripped him off, which a lot of slaves were doing that, in that they would take off, and there's so many of them, almost half the population. So slaves would commonly bolt and then go to some other city and start to try to live like in the underworld and try to escape view, live in subculture and just sort of get away from everything so that they could be free of their debt and their ownership. So you kind of had this subculture, and he ends up meeting up with Paul. So even in Onesimus' own life, there is a correction here, where Paul is even implying in this that he's holding Onesimus in such a way, not like, handcuffs, but with enough of a relationship and a connection that he would turn right around and say to Onesimus, you need to go back to your master. But Paul's very clear in his agenda here that he is wanting that to be broken. All things forgiven. If there's money involved, Paul says, I'll take care of it. So it's pretty powerful, the letter. I think it would have been like a sudden shot of espresso for Philemon when he read this letter, that came in the mail. So I think it would have really jolted him. Yeah. Yes, AJ.
James McDonald used it in an interesting way. He ended up gone, and like the way he used it.
I'm sorry, who's that?
James McDonald.
James McDonald, okay.
The way that he used it was kind of interesting. He ended up gone, and like he was saying that if you end up gone, and let's say you're right with two people, but these two people are not right with each other, that God would want you to reconcile them.
If you're, could you state that again, AJ?
Yeah. If you yourself were right with this person and this person,
Yeah.
but these two were not right with each other,
Right.
God would want you to take and to reconcile them, if they're Christians, that is.
Right. The calling, I believe it, AJ, that God calls certain people to be reconcilers of the brothers and sisters. Precious saints who, for whatever reason, were once happy in the Lord together and no longer happy in Jesus, shaking hands, giving each other the holy kiss of that time. Absolutely, I believe God calls people to be reconcilers. Some of you will be put in positions, we don't always know when. I believe in this room, some of you are going to be put in the midst of very sensitive situations. In the grace of God on you, the grace in you and your openness and love and compassion is going to be key for bringing people back together by the, not AJ, not just because that you're like, oh, well, there's no one better to do this, but by the appointment of God, because he wants us to be walking together in grace and fellowship. He wants us to fellowship. And, but to say that we have to make it happen, you know, we realize that we're in the middle, and we have good connection with both, and the recognition is there, realization, oh, I could be a reconciler for these people. I better do something. I would say the first thing you better do, and I better do, is pray and wait and think on it and watch, unless there is an urgency there and a time factor, some circumstance that says if you don't do it now, the opportunity will never be there again. But if there is some time and there's a way of thinking about it and looking at it that says we have time here, we're living our lives, we're carrying on, and we're praying about it, I would say be careful before you rush into trying to bring people together. Because sometimes people need space from each other. Good, godly people, good, godly, mature people of integrity are going to need space from each other for a while, sometimes, because of things that were said or things that happened. And so I want to say first, be Spirit-led. Grace also lets us say, okay, I love that brother, or I love that sister, and I love this one too, and I don't love the way that they're thinking and feeling about each other, but I need to let some time pass here and walk with them and be patient, exercise patience, fruit of the Spirit. That fruit of the Spirit, I think that's, who else thinks that's one of the hardest fruits of the Spirit besides me? Patience, waiting for people, waiting for God. Waiting for God also often involves waiting on people who are the connecting points of what God is doing. I like to try to say things in short little statements, you know, but that is just so loaded with challenge and struggle, including these matters, AJ. So I wish I wish that our love and perspective could bring everybody together. Have you ever, I'm not putting you on the spot, but haven't we all had times where we loved somebody but we needed space from them? Who's been there before? We needed to back out of the situation and say, I love that brother or that sister in Jesus, and I can't look at that person at least until spring or whatever. And you know what? There's probably people that have thought that way about you before. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's so important that we walk in humility. And but AJ, I believe with all my heart that God has his hand on certain people, partly because because they know them, but they weren't in the heat of things, and because he's given them a temperament. And they have been exercising in humility, walking in humility before God, and they exude grace and humility. That he puts his hand on people and arranges things sovereignly so that they're stuck in the middle. See, that's the other thing is, I'm just thinking about what you're saying here. I do think that God will make it for us at sometimes, those of us that he's going to do that with, to where we feel stuck. We're like, why would the Lord put me in the middle of this? I don't want to deal with this mess, right? But if we're honest and we're acknowledging that we believe God, at least to some degree, sovereignly controls and arranges circumstances, which I affirm that, then we would say, okay, Lord, tell me what you want me to do. Hallelujah. I've already got enough struggles in my life. It feels like enough faith tests of my own. And if you want me to be involved in this mess with these people, okay. And so certainly here, Paul is stepping in, seeing himself as the connecting point. And I would say, AJ, that there was an urgency here because we had illegal activity going on. We have the laws being broken, someone's livelihood and life on the line for the penalties, that could be brought against him. The urgency of the time and even the opportunity that Paul saw to right a social wrong in the church, in the Colossian church. So Paul saw everything coming together, and he seized the opportunity to speak a word into it. Yeah, it's awesome, isn't it? When you really start thinking what's going on here, it's pretty amazing for this little letter that we have. Aren't you glad it was preserved for us? Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Good. That's important because that brings it home, AJ. Your question just says, what do we do with this when we're in situations? So most likely it won't be in a slavery situation. It will be an issue of rights of leadership. Who has the word of what we were going to do count for our ministry project? Or, so we could go through tons of examples of where that kind of thing is going to come up. Maybe it's in family. I think it's harder in family. If it's family members, blood family. So, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, Scott.
Going back to like Onesimus, do you think it's fair to say that like slavery is like so much different now than it is then? Do you think like saying that like Onesimus spent so much time with Paul and that Philemon owed Paul, to say that you can expand it out to I think like slavery now is super evil, so much worse than it was like then, when they were educated and stuff. But do you think you can do that to, with the special circumstances, to be able to extend it out and say, okay, we're called to do this as like the position of the Bible? Or?
Right. I would say that, well, aren't the statistics that there's way more slavery now than there was like even in like the late 1800s and early 1900s? There's like way more slavery now in the world. What's that?
27 million.
27 million people in slavery?
Is the statistic, yeah.
Wow. So it's worse. It hasn't gotten better. We've, in our country, we've just had we've addressed the issue through thick and thin, and things have gone well, and things have not gone so well in freeing people because of race, but sort of, and it's worse. And so I would say, since the need is worse and slavery tends to be even more severe and violent and oppressive, the kinds that go on in the world today, we're here in this day. Slaves could have certain like high positions in families and stuff and have good pay and things, or have certain privileges that would make them better off than some commoners. Sometimes that's not like that today. It's like an abuse ownership for the most part today, taking advantage of people, and so I would say absolutely all the more. Yeah. Calling for the law to be involved in making busts and things. And so, yeah. So I'd say we shouldn't have a lot of trouble translating these principles, New Testament principles, Paul's theology of equality in Christ. I would say it's very, very safe philosophically and theologically to translate that into the world of action against slavery. Yeah. Yep. Including some believers who say it's not just to teach and preach. I am going to be an FBI agent so that I can be one who tears doors down and rams into people's homes to snatch people out of that. Oh, yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Do we know how Onesimus ended up in jail along, like, with Paul?
Yeah, was he in jail? It's possible. It makes me, I would say almost it's implied because he had been on the run and somehow nabbed. Because he had been on the run and he was, his situation now was, it was a problem. Because Philemon might come looking for him. And there's an urgency there. I don't think Paul says, though, that he's in prison with him, but he certainly has the contact with him or some kind of immediate connection. So,
He was under house arrest.
Paul was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so then he wasn't in prison.
Right, yeah, so if Paul's under house arrest, maybe he just hears that Onesimus is in the city or something. So, that's right. Thank you, Heidi. Yep.
Another question.
Yeah.
Often when we talk about other areas where Paul talks about slavery, we translate it to like employment, modern.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you translate this to modern employment instead of slavery and social injustice?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, and I often do that. Where Paul says, masters, don't be harsh with your slaves, because remember that God is your master, and we're quick to put that into the job world, and we say, and I've even said before, that so many jobs in the working world are like being under a master, because you're just sort of given work to do, and they have a lot of power and resources that we don't have if you're working for the man, as the saying goes. So, but I don't think that translation is always, that translation over into the work world doesn't catch everything. It's just sort of the first point for us of understanding. And it's not really what's going on. Well, some of them were working for them. But they also had relationships with the people. And why don't we do that with Philemon? I guess because it has to do with the ultimate point of whether Philemon can continue to have rights over him, or if he should let him go and release him from his position of being over. So I think it has to do with the ultimate right. Who has rights and who doesn't. Where Paul's other places address the ongoing relationship of masters and slaves. This is like a break. Paul's word here is break it off. Let him go. So, so that's a little different than the workforce. Did that answer it? Yeah. All right. Well, we have a little time here, and I think I missed a hand over here. Oh, 1 minute. I always like to use that last minute. Yeah, Joseph.
I've heard it taught, but I don't know how true it is. Is it true that Onesimus was the person who delivered the letter to Philemon?
I've heard that too. And I'd have to say that's what I've always had in mind, that it was Onesimus taking the letter, making it all the more like, in your face, so to speak, for Philemon, when his rightfully owned property is there, and then he gets this letter. I'll just keep that in mind, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah. So that would make sense with Paul's emphasis that he wants Onesimus to be viewed as a partner in the gospel, that he would even be so, and that would match the tone of the letter, that Paul would be so audacious to have Philemon carry it. That certainly wouldn't be a straying away from the theme of the letter. Pretty radical. So that's a great question. And we will end on that one. May the Lord bless you today.